So this is Trevor. One of our software engineers, and he's a software craftsman, and I'm gonna ask him a couple of questions about microservices since it's a really big thing, and I'm just gonna go ahead and explain to us what is a microservice and why is it a good thing for software development.
So I guess from a really high level, I would start by saying that microservices is kind of a way to move away from a monolithic system, which is you have a really large system that everyone develops in the same code base. All of the pieces of the code base can interact with each other directly. And one of the main differences with a monolithic system and a microservices based system is you split each of the aspects that you are able to split out into its own separate service or microservice with its own potentially its own infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but you split it all out so that you have these very small units that can operate independently from all the other aspects of the system. So one of the main benefits that comes from a microservice-based architecture is the flexibility or the agility, which is a buzzword these days, and more specifically architectural flexibility. So say one of the things that you can do that's really hard with a monolithic system is you might have some need for a new technology that comes out that maybe a new database technology. With a microservice, it's pretty easy to swap the database that's under only that service because the other aspects or the other pieces of your domain, nobody else is interacting with that data in that database. And so that pulls out kind of one of the rules of microservice architectures is each service has to have its own database. If you're going to use a database, you're not going to allow multiple microservices to communicate with that database, because you end up getting back to a coupled state anyway, and you become a monolith essentially overall. Kind of one interesting way of looking at it is when you are designing a new class in a monolith, you want to design the API for that class to be used by someone outside of that. And in a microservice-based architecture, you can kind of think of a microservice as a class, but instead of just using your API based on your methods that you add to that class, you're instead using some sort of maybe like a REST interface, or maybe you have XML RPC. You need some other way that allows you to a lot better enforce your API to anyone else that wants to consume that API. And so overall, it gives you a nice barrier that you can enforce, whereas in a monolithic system, it's way too easy for a single class to go out and use a whole bunch of other classes that it really shouldn't have access to. It's too easy to avoid using an API that was designed by somebody else and just kind of avoid using that API and go access things directly. Whereas with the microservice architecture, you can do a lot better job of enforcing those types of things and force people to use your API properly.
So is it costly to adapt a microservice? Let's say I'm a business owner and I don't know much about the technical side of things, but the architecture and the senior software engineers like yourself, architects like yourself, they get to decide that from a cost perspective, and that really what it boils down to, because the back end, the end user doesn't really see what we're doing on the back end. So from a cost perspective, how does the microservices play a better role than a monolithic?
Yeah, so I would say that's kind of a two-headed beast. First of all, is the negative side. Yes, there are significant costs to getting started with microservices. There's a lot more infrastructure. It becomes really a no question that you have to do automated testing. You can't really get away anymore with manual testing, because your architecture is going to grow and flex, and just do things that are outside of your abilities to do manual tests. So there are costs like that. There are just true direct costs that when you're using microservices, you have to have different types of infrastructure that can stand things up. You no longer have one large database. You might have 6 small databases. And you have to have people that can operate those. Another thing that it brings about, kind of like the automated testing, is you need a way to keep track of your infrastructure, automate your deployment of your infrastructure. I suppose you could get away with not automating your deployment of the infrastructure, but it would become really difficult, if not impossible, over time as you get a number of microservices. Now the flip side, or the second head of the beast, is the positive side. You can something that would have been really difficult to do. For example, back to the database, the single database that everyone uses. All of a sudden, you need to make a schema change or something. If you have a microservice-based architecture, that schema change is a tiny cost on your developers to go and change the services that interact with that. Whereas you change your schema in a monolithic architecture, you might be putting days, months, weeks, maybe a year into fixing your system to accommodate that change. So yeah, just high level, quick summary. Yeah, there's some positives, some negatives, but there is definitely a startup cost with microservices.
So let me ask you this. I already invested in a project, and I paid a lot of money, and the developers that I hired, they made it into a monolithic system. And I want to move towards the microservices in order for me to be more agile when it comes new user requirements. I want to make sure that my architecture is flexible enough to adapt any new changes or any new technologies.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how hard that change would be, and if you have your typical developer, you have a senior developer that never developed for microservices, and how hard is it going to be for them to adapt a microservice architecture and start actually to move forward with it, and so I don't have to train people, I don't have to hire people, I don't have to all I just really need to do is just to tell them what to do, the developers, tell them to adapt this architecture and move forward with it. How hard would it be to move from a monolithic system for an existing application?
Yeah, so I'd answer the latter question first, along the lines of how hard is it for developers to pick up and become accustomed to the new situation. There are some changes that it does cause. Your developers also sort of become operations guys. They have to start to understand that I'm going to carry this product all the way from my code change all the way through to production. And that's quite a change. You can't anymore write some code and turn it over to the operations guys, because your team is the operations guys. It's truly the DevOps culture. I think it would be, you may be able to pull it off without using a DevOps kind of mindset, but I feel like that would be really difficult because you would constantly be waiting on people to do things for you, and you would essentially kill the ability to do continuous integration. The other piece of that is if you start out with a monolithic system, is that bad? Some of the thought leaders in microservices, Sam Newman is one. He actually recommends not starting based on a microservice architecture, but instead starting with a monolithic architecture and breaking it down once you understand your domain. So based off some of the ideas out of what's called domain-driven design, you start creating your boundaries at certain edges that are separate and independent. And at least they argue that that's really difficult to determine at the start of a project. You don't really understand your domain yet, and therefore you can't just go out and produce a microservice architecture. So that's not a bad thing at all to be having a monolithic architecture. If it's a total mess, It might be a challenge to break it down, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
So my last question would be, what are the technologies that you advise developers out there to look at when they want to implement a microservice architecture? What are the things that are more comfortable to work with, things that are very friendly when it comes to microservices from a cloud perspective, from a technology perspective? What programming languages, what databases?
That's difficult to answer, but there is the quick and easy answer that is microservices allow you to use varying technologies. You know, if something new comes out, you can try it in one small piece of your stack. You no longer have to, if you want to try, say we're using Scala right now, say you want to move from Java to Scala, maybe that's a bad example. What's more dramatic? Maybe like a C++ to all the way to Scala. You're moving to the JVM from C++. In a microservice-based architecture, you can do that because they're completely separate applications and they all run independently. And so it allows you to do things like that, which is really nice. One thing that I would actually recommend is understanding a deployment pipeline and using some sort of tools to handle that and automate your ability to deploy is really nice. And I suppose that's only if you're in industry. If you're operating on your own and you're writing a kind of maybe a smaller application, I suspect it's based on your skill set and the fact that microservice architectures are so flexible. You really have that. You really have the choice. I'm not sure that even one programming language would be easier than another. There are things like AWS that allow you to write a very small node application, and not even really an application. You can instead use AWS's Lambda architecture that it takes a request, processes that request, and it's done. You don't have any computer infrastructure behind it. It's a server. The word for it is serverless backend, and so it just fires up on demand, and then it dies once it's done doing its processing. And so, I guess to sum all that up, kind of a roundabout way of explaining that, but summing all that up, microservices really give you just the flexibility to make your own choice on what you think would be useful.
Thank you so much.